Did early Christians take their theology about Jesus Christ from the pagan worship of the mythical god Mithras? What is the Holy Grail? Is it the cup of Christ, or is it instead a reference to Jesus' bloodline preserved through Mary Magdalene? Did Leonardo Da Vinci paint clues in The Last Supper that reveal an alternative view of Christianity? The historical facts and the literary fiction differ radically in response to these questions, not only in the Da Vinci Code, but throughout modern pulp culture. Numerous websites, books, and other various publications seek to infuse into our society a worldview that promotes the mystical while disparaging the biblical. Robert Langdon and Lee Teabing, the fictional scholars in the Da Vinci Code, heartily embrace the idea that Christianity borrowed its core doctrines about Christ from the Roman worship of Mithras. They believe that the Holy Grail refers to the bloodline of Christ, and that Leonardo da Vinci hid codes in his paintings that are anti-orthodox. This comes as no surprise, since these are the views of Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code. Brown has been heavily influenced by such books as The Templar Revelation by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, The Woman with the Alabaster Jar by Margaret Starbird, and Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. All of these books are mentioned in the Da Vinci Code as valid historical resources. Interestingly, the character of Lee Teabing derives his name from two of the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Lee and Bagent, of which Teabing is an anagram. This shows the influence these authors have had on Dan Brown in developing his characters and his theological theories. Teabing claims that Christianity in the 4th century redefined Jesus Christ. He states, "Nothing in Christianity is original. The pre-Christian god Mithras, called the Son of God and the Light of the World, was born on December 25th, was buried in a rock tomb, and then resurrected in 3 days." What Dan Brown fails to note is that the Roman worship of Mithras did not occur until the 2nd century AD, about 100 years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Nor does he mention the differences between the Persian and Roman mythology of Mithras. The ancient Persians worshipped Ahura Mazda, who is considered the god of wisdom and sky, or light. Originally, Mithras, whom the Persians called Mithra, was believed to be the chief angel of Ahura Mazda, and later was considered to be his son. Like Ahura Mazda, Mithras was called the god of light. The Persians taught that Mithras was born from a rock and engaged in the great battle between good and evil, or light and darkness, by fighting evil. To aid him in his battle, he sacrificed a bull, which is why many of his images show him killing a bull. One could extrapolate from this that Mithras was the Son of God and the light of the world. However, this is classic mythology describing the struggle of good and evil. This same struggle is typified in most religions and can be found in ancient texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which speaks of the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and even the modern Star Wars trilogies between the Force and the dark side. The Persian worship of Mithras did not claim he was born of a virgin, died for our sins, was placed in a tomb, and rose from the dead. They did not believe Mithras was God who became flesh and dwelt among us, as Christians believe. The Romans were notorious for taking the gods and theology of other nations and incorporating them into their own. This is what happened with the Roman worship of Mithras. The Roman military took him as their god, reviving this ancient mystery religion, and limited it to males only. It is not until the 3rd and 4th centuries that we find the Roman worship of Mithras making reference to a virgin birth, resurrection from the dead, the celebration of December 25th as his birthday, and the taking of wine and bread as part of Mithras worship. Dan Brown and many others have mistakenly taken the worship of Mithras as revised in the 4th century AD and read back into the worship of Mithras that predates Christianity. As one studies the history of this religion, they discover that these similarities were added after the establishment of biblical Christianity in the 1st century, and that Roman Mithras worship took some of its theology and practices from Christianity. In 160 AD, Justin Martyr, while discussing the Eucharist, writes, which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. You either know or can learn. Tertullian around 200 AD and Origen around 250 AD also noted that the Roman worship of Mithras took many of their beliefs and practices from Christianity. As to the phrase, Son of God, referring to Jesus Christ, it is not only found in the New Testament, but is prophesied as a title for the Messiah in the Old Testament, hundreds of years before the Persian worship of Mithras. Dan Brown also has Lee Teabing claim that the Holy Grail was not a chalice or cup, but instead a reference to the bloodline of Christ through Mary Magdalene. Through a series of word origins combined with ancient fables about Mary, a modern myth is woven about the Holy Grail, which is itself a myth without historical evidence. The mythology of the Holy Grail claims that it was not only the cup which Christ drank from at the Last Supper, but was also used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch the blood of Christ at the crucifixion, and later taken to Great Britain. The stories of the Holy Grail are not found in the Bible, but instead originate around the 12th century AD. The New Testament only mentions that at the Last Supper, Christ took a cup, blessed its contents, and likened the wine to his blood and the bread to his body, thereby instituting the celebration of the Eucharist or communion. The emphasis is not on the cup, but on its contents, and what it represents in the suffering and death of Christ for our sins, for it is through his blood that we have redemption from sin. In the Da Vinci Code, Lee Teabing points to Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, and notes that there is no Holy Grail or cup on the table. He then points out that the person to the right of Christ is not John the Beloved, but is instead Mary Magdalene. Accordingly, Leonardo encoded a message held secret by the Priori of Zion, namely that the true Holy Grail was not a cup, but a person, Mary Magdalene, and that she held the blood of Christ in her body as she was pregnant with Christ's child. It is true that unlike many paintings of the Last Supper, Leonardo does not paint the Holy Grail. But Leonardo did paint cups, which are clearly placed before each of the disciples. In fact, the left hand of Christ passes over a cup in Leonardo's painting. The presence of cups of wine dismisses the premise of the Da Vinci Code, because the cup of Christ is on the table. The person to Christ's right does look feminine, at least compared to the other disciples in the painting. The Da Vinci Code claims that between this person and Christ there is a V shape, a symbol for the sacred feminine, and the book claims an M can be seen in the painting also, which is a code for Mary Magdalene. The book also maintains that Peter is making a threatening gesture towards the John-Mary figure, while an ominous knife dangles from an unknown source. Others add to this, stating that Leonardo painted himself in the Last Supper with his back turned towards Christ as a symbol of his rejection of Orthodox Christianity. In order to interpret the painting in this fashion, one has to overlook a great number of facts. First, the person to Christ's right is really the Apostle John, and not Mary Magdalene. If this were Mary, the obvious question is, what happened to John? All of the disciples are represented. Why would John be left out? Almost all paintings of the Last Supper paint John effeminately. This was an artistic device to show purity, just as angels are painted as female or small children. The point was not to capture the true outward appearance, but instead the inward nature of the subject painted. Second, while a V can be drawn between John and Jesus, this overlooks the balance Leonardo used in painting the Last Supper. Christ sits in the center of the painting in a triangular shape. The 12 disciples are divided into groups of 3, each forming a triangle. The V shape